Hey, welcome to Cosmic Comics. Today I'm going to take a break from tradition and just spend some time talking about a series instead of a story arc. Today's topic is The New Warriors. Heroes for the 90s! In the summer of 1990, Marvel did a big promotional push of bringing in a bunch of new, hip, edgy heroes that were supposed to spark the imaginations of the 90s youth and get them to spend some money on comic books. I had recently started collecting and remember being excited about the upcoming titles, mainly because I felt that it gave me something that was missing, a fresh place to start within the Marvel Universe. Many of the books I might have otherwise been interested in were titles that were already in the hundreds when it came to issue number, and without the aid of the internet, there was no way I could ever fill myself in on that much backstory. I felt like there was no way for me to be an informed reader of these titles. One example that doesn't take backstories or recurring characters into account is Spider-Man. Spider-Man had multiple titles out at the time, and I wasn't sure how that worked. Was there more than one Spider-Man? Are they set in different eras? I had no idea, so I thought it just best to leave it alone. It all just seemed way too complicated for a newbie. I was turned off from Spider-Man because, from an outsider looking in, I couldn't make sense about what was going on. My point is that Marvel's strategy of introducing new characters and new titles worked, and pushed up the number of monthly pulls on my list. One of the titles that quickly got added to my pulls list was The New Warriors. At first I wasn't certain Marvel meant it when they said that they were going for an edgier feel, but when the first issue opens, with the up-and-coming leader of this group dropping a powerless superhero off a rooftop, I knew they were committed. I remember reading those panels all those years ago and the queasiness it made my guts tie up into. I wasn't certain that I liked Night Thrasher. In fact, I'm still not certain how I feel about his character to this day, but that's a whole other discussion. So the initial group of heroes for the New Warriors is Dwayne Taylor, Night Thrasher, Richard Rider as Nova, Vance Astrovic as Marvel Boy, Angelica Jones as Firestar, Robbie Baldwin as Speedball, and Namorita as herself. Some of the things I did while researching this piece were to look at each of the characters' first appearance, see how many total appearances each character has had, and look at the number of appearances prior to joining the New Warriors. Going into this magazine as a young teen, I had no idea that some of these characters had already been around for longer than I had been alive at the time. Many of these characters were over 20 years old. The first thing I'd like to point out is that Namorita, Marvel Boy, and Nova are all pretty old characters at this point, each with at least a decade or more under their belt. Firestar comes in next, followed by Speedball, who clocked in at a massive 22 appearances before showing up in the New Warriors. All of those from across a span of less than 2 years. No surprise that Nova had the most appearances prior to the New Warriors, as he had a rather successful series of his own for about 2 years. The point behind all this being that outside of Night Thrasher, these new heroes for the 90s were all carrying a bunch of baggage from the 70s and 80s with them. Originally, Night Thrasher only wanted Nova, Marvel Boy, and Firestar for his team, but ended up taking on Namorita and Speedball as well when the group formed immediately after they had beat Terrax at the end of issue number 1. The series had a number of great themes, such as fighting back against genocide or environmental degradation. They really did a good job of capturing the themes that were relevant to 90s youth at the time. Another theme that was there all along, but never hardly ever discussed in the original series, were issues of who you are based on how you look, how you were born, or disability. There were a few minor issues around nobody wanting Hindsight Lad to be allowed to join the team because he didn't have superpowers, but he continued to push back, and there always seemed to be others associated with the group as full-time members that didn't have powers as well, and that really gave him the end that he needed to keep making that push. In an age where the X-Men were constantly fighting back against oppression that continuously threatened their very existence, it was refreshing to see a group of mutants, non-mutants, superheroes, and normals all working together as a supergroup. As for race, it was always being made such a big deal over how the Submariner interacted with surface dwellers and if he was going to get along with them or not at this time. But it was never mentioned at all with Namorita. By the time the second year is rolled around for the series, half of the team is African American. I don't know if this was part of Marvel's vision for the series or not, as it never stuck out to me at the time. But looking back, I mean, wow, the New Warriors were one of the most progressive teams out there. Well, that is until they decided to abandon all the black people and tell them to make their own team towards the end of the series. I love the themes, and I love the characters, but what I hated about this comic, and what eventually caused me to drop it from my pulls, was not being able to follow the storyline without having to buy another comic. I was on a limited budget back then, and allowance money only goes so far. Not to mention other things like video games and eventually cars, girls, and magic cards coming along that competed for the dollars in my wallet. I wanted to know what was happening to Night Thrasher, Silhouette, Rage, and Nova, but I couldn't justify putting the money down on 3 different comics to keep up with what was happening in one. It was so frustrating to me that I was actually a little bit happy when I saw that the Nova and Night Thrasher series had both been cancelled in under 2 years, because I hoped it meant a stronger presence for them both within the New Warriors. I'll admit that I've never gotten around to reading either of those series. I've had it on my I'll eventually catch up to that list for close to 20 years now, and I know it's only because of a lingering resentment that I've never been willing to fork over the cash to pick up either one of these series. That was then, and this is now. Both series are definitely on my radar again, but I'm still not there yet. And yes, if you're just reading The Warriors, these separate series seem to wrap up huge holes that were pressing plot points early in the Warriors run. Holes that should have been filled within the pages of New Warriors. Another thing that struck me while rereading this series is the shocking age differences between some of the characters. Speedball and Rage are both only 14 for most, if not all of the first series. Taking these two out of state, not to mention out of the country and into war zones without explicit permission of their parents, seems highly dubious and very illegal. Their ages also increase the horrible cringeworthiness of Speedball's often excessive hitting on seemingly anything with boobs and spandex. And his creep factor just keeps getting creepier and creepier the further the series goes on. This got so bad that Speedball, who had been one of my favorite characters, was somebody I wanted no association with, and even as a teen could see that his behavior was nothing short of sexual harassment. Let's stop and think about the ages of everybody involved here. Rage and Speedball are established at 14. Firestar is either 17 or 18 and hasn't completed high school yet. Vance is somewhere in his early 20s. Nova has a girlfriend in college for the first part of the series and seems to be on the front half of his 20s, but could be older. Namorita, on the other hand, is most likely on the latter half of her mid-20s. But this in and of itself was confusing to me, as I had comics that showed her going to college back in the 60s or 70s, and it had yet to be established that this Namorita was a clone. Thrasher, I'm not really certain about what his age was at the time, but I'd guess late 20s to early 30s. Cord, whom I haven't mentioned up to this point, is their pilot/technical guru, and is probably at the least in his 40s. At least 2 of the members of the New Warriors had been turned down by the Avengers. Speedball because Captain America didn't think he had enough control over his power to be an effective fighter, and Marvel Boy, who was turned away due to his lack of experience. Rage, on the other hand, at 14 was accepted into the Avengers until he was eventually kicked out for stealing a Quinjet for the Warriors. This brings me to my next point. Stealing a Quinjet from the Avengers had hardly any consequences. On down the road, the Warriors would continue to steal from the Avengers by hindsight-led, embezzling funds by posing the Warriors' hideout as an auxiliary Avengers base. The Avengers attack to find out what's been going on, but nothing ever really comes of it outside of the fact that they need to find a new source of funding. Mind you that Hindsight Boy was only 14 years old when he was committing these crimes. Stealing a Quinjet and embezzling funds is enough to get some groups thrown into the bad guys group, but I gather since they were so young and edgy and hip that the New Warriors didn't always have to play by the rules. Okay, but the New Warriors did occasionally have to play by the rules. One of the major plot lines throughout the central portion of the series is Marvel Boy killing his father with the use of his telekinetic powers. For this crime, Vance was eventually found guilty of homicide and had to spend just over 1 year in jail. So, obviously there were consequences for actions. In my recent rereading of the series, I was oftentimes shocked to see the contrast between Marvel Boy, who killed his abusive father by mistake, and most of the rest of the team, who at some point in time or another outright make the decision to kill somebody, with both the team and or the law deciding to look the other direction out of convenience. The best example of this I can think of is Rage, who consciously makes the decision to kill someone in front of the group, and they all decide not to confront him and just let it slide. In fact, they cover for him later. This is pretty reprehensible behavior for superheroes, especially for one who is only 14 years old. This is the moment when some of the older members of the Warriors should have stopped and taken a hard look at the child soldiers they were actively creating. Yes, child soldiers, that's exactly what they were creating. Another big turnoff for me in the series was the introduction of Turbo. It would have been nice to see a fresh character idea brought into the series, but once more, Fabian Nicieza, I've never known how to pronounce that guy's last name, went for a throwback from the 80s. I would have loved to have seen any of the characters from Psionics, a team of bad guys the Warriors faced off against from time to time starting with issue 4, brought on board instead of Turbo. I could go on, and yes, there were a few more heroes who joined the Warriors along the way, but I feel that I've covered both the good and the bad here of the series, and anything else I have to add would just be rehashing the same sentiments over and over again. After 75 issues, the New Warriors wrapped up. It felt more like a fizzle than a bang, but any fans of Richard Rider as Nova should enjoy the story arcs of the last year or so of publication. Thanks for joining me as I veered away from my normal format for an episode. Let me know if you like this format, and I may come back and discuss New Warriors Volume 2 or another series. Feel free to hit any of the buttons below. I'm out.